I was never chosen. Not as a child. Not as a daughter. Not even when my brother's life was on the line. And yet, when everyone else turned their back on me, I did something none of them expected. I chose myself. This is a story of how I stopped begging to belong and started becoming my own home. It started with a phone call, one that came without warning. Your brother's in critical condition. He needs a liver transplant. And you might be the only match. I didn't cry. I didn't ask questions. I just booked the flight. That night, as the plane soared above the clouds, I looked out the window, waiting for some kind of feeling to rise in my chest. But there was nothing. Not panic, not sadness, not even anger. Just silence. An old silence. One I had lived with since I was a little girl. Because deep down, I already knew what this was. It wasn't a call to check if I was okay. It wasn't about love. It was a request. Once again, I was being needed, not wanted. When I arrived at the hospital, no one hugged me. No one looked relieved. No one said, "Thank you for coming. How was your flight? Are you okay?" Instead, they pointed down a long hallway and said, "He's in there." Like I was the delivery guy. Not family. Not a daughter. Just an organ on legs. But it wasn't new. That's how it had always been. I was the emergency backup. The spare part. The child they remembered only when things fell apart. Growing up, my brother was the center of everything. Tall, handsome, brilliant. He got straight A's without trying. He made friends like breathing. He was everything my father ever wanted in a child. And me? I was the shadow that followed behind. Quiet, polite, always trying to earn a space in the light. I joined every club. I got good grades. I never talked back. I became the good girl, the dependable one, the at least she's not causing trouble child. But deep down, I knew the truth. Being good doesn't guarantee you'll be loved. Sometimes it just makes you invisible. That night, alone in the cold guest room, I laid on my back staring at the ceiling. I thought about how I had dropped everything to fly here. How I'd taken leave from work, bought a last-minute ticket, and packed in a rush. How I had walked into this hospital like a soldier returning from war, ready to offer whatever they needed again. And yet, no one had even asked how I was doing. No one asked if I was scared, if I was tired, if I had eaten, if I wanted to say no. It hit me then, not like a slap, but like a slow, deep ache. I didn't want to be needed anymore. I want to be seen. And for the first time in my life, I let myself ask the most forbidden question. What if I don't owe them anything? Not love, not loyalty, not sacrifice. Because family shouldn't be a contract you're guilted into signing. Sometimes love is not about staying. Sometimes love is letting go of the weight, of the silence, and of a need to be chosen by those who never saw your worth. That night, I made a quiet decision. If they only saw me as useful, then I would no longer be available. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I just whispered, "No more." And that small whisper was the loudest I had ever been in my entire life. I remember my graduation day like a photograph burned into the back of my mind. The sky was clear. My heart was racing. I had ironed my gown the night before, rehearsed my smile, and kept checking the crowd every 5 seconds. I told myself, maybe he's just late. Maybe he got caught in traffic. Maybe. But I knew. My father wasn't coming. He had called that morning and said, "I've got a meeting. It's important. I'll try, but don't wait for me." I didn't cry. Not then. Because this wasn't the first time. He had missed every parent-teacher night, every awards ceremony, every moment that mattered to me. But somehow, he never missed a single football game of my brother's. When they called my name on stage, I walked up, smiled for the camera, held my diploma high, and when I turned to the seats, there was no one, no waving hand, no proud eyes, no one waiting to hug me, just an empty chair where my father should have been. And in that moment, something inside me stopped expecting, not out of bitterness, but out of survival, because the heart can only hope so many times before it learns to stop hurting itself. That day, I graduated from more than just school. I graduated from waiting for someone who had already chosen where he wanted to be. At 18, I packed everything I had into one suitcase. No one stopped me. No one asked, "Are you sure? Do you have enough money? Do you want us to visit someday?" I left like a tenant moving out of an old apartment. Quiet, unnoticed. And for the first time, I wasn't sad. because deep down I knew I was finally walking away from a place where I was always present, but never truly seen. I moved to another country, new air, new language, new streets to get lost in. It was terrifying at first. I made mistakes, forgot directions, ran out of money, cried in small rooms. But I was free, free from comparison, free from judgment, free from having to perform the role of the good daughter. I found work, made friends who liked me for my sarcasm, not my silence. People who remember my birthday, who showed up on time, who listened without fixing. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And each day, I stitched together a version of life that finally felt like living. Not one made to impress, just one that let me breathe. And the more distance I created, the more I began to realize something quietly painful. They never really followed. Not a visit, not a message, not a question like, "Are you okay? Do you miss us? Do you feel at home?" Because maybe I was never really theirs to begin with. Coming back felt strange. The hallway smelled the same. The furniture hadn't moved. The curtains were still the ones Mom had picked out a decade ago. Even the clock on the wall ticked with the same tired rhythm. But me? I didn't belong here anymore. There's something eerie about returning to a place where your body remembers pain, but your heart no longer fits. I looked around and realized the walls had never heard my voice. The air had never carried my laughter. I had grown up here, but this house had never known me. They greeted me like I was a guest. Polite, civil, a little distant. "There's tea on the table. Your brother's in his room. Thanks for coming." Not once did anyone say, "We missed you. How have you been? We're proud of you." The only thing that felt familiar was the silence. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't admitted before. You can return to the place you once called home and still feel like a stranger. But the strangest part? I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt. I just felt done. Done searching for warmth in cold places. Done handing out pieces of myself to people who never looked back. I was here for one reason: to answer a call, to do what I always did. But this time, I wasn't going to leave empty anymore. The doctor called me into his office. His face was calm, but his tone was careful. Too careful. He handed me a file. The compatibility results came back. He said. I took a breath, braced for whatever number or percentage he was about to read out. But what he said next wasn't what I expected. "You're not a match." My shoulders dropped from something that wasn't quite relief, but wasn't disappointment either. And then, as he closed the file, he added, almost as an afterthought, "Also, the results indicate a discrepancy in parentage. Biologically speaking, your father may not be your father." The world didn't spin. Time didn't stop. Nothing dramatic happened. Except inside me. Everything tilted. I stared at him. Not because I didn't understand, but because suddenly I did. I understood the coldness. The distance. The way I was always second best. Or not even on the list. I understood the unanswered questions. The unspoken tension. The subtle looks exchanged when no one thought I was watching. And just like that, the story I had been told my whole life cracked wide open. He wasn't just uninterested. He had never seen me as his. After the doctor's truth, I walked out of that office with a file in my hand and an earthquake in my chest. But when I came home, no one noticed. No one asked, "Are you okay? What did the doctor say? Do you want to talk?" They just stared at me, waiting for an answer to one question only. "Are you the match?" That was all that mattered. Not how I was feeling, not the look on my face, not the storm I was holding back inside. Just that one answer. I said, "No, I'm not." Someone sighed. Someone else muttered, "We'll have to look for another option." And then they went on with their day, as if I hadn't just discovered that. The man I had called father all my life wasn't. As if I hadn't just unraveled every memory I'd ever held on to. As if I hadn't just been erased and redrawn in the span of a single sentence. But the worst part wasn't their indifference. It wasn't even the truth itself. It was the silence. The kind of silence that screams, "We only care about what you can give. Not who you are. Not your pain. Not your peace. Only your function." That silence wrapped around me like fog. It didn't choke me. It just made it harder to believe I was ever real to them. And in that moment, I knew I had never truly belonged here. And I never would. I couldn't stop looking at that file, even after I told them, even after their indifference. I sat in the small room they gave me, the same one I used to sleep in as a child, now filled with boxes and dust, as if even the space had moved on from me. And I opened the file again. At the bottom of the page, in cold, clinical print, paternity could not be confirmed with current tested subject. Additional tests advised. That was it. No emotion, no explanation, just data. But in those lines, I saw my whole life finally make sense. The rejection, the coldness, the backhanded comments, the silence. He must have known, or at least suspected, and instead of asking, instead of seeking clarity, instead of confronting the truth, he chose to punish me for it. Not openly, not with fists or words, but with absence, with distance, with the kind of cold that makes a child believe they're hard to love. And I spent years trying to earn back a place that was never really mine, trying to win a father who never wanted to play that role. That night, I didn't cry. I just sat in that dusty room, placed the file in the drawer beside my bed, and whispered to myself, "You're not broken. You were just misplaced." I handed her the paper. I didn't say a word. I just placed it gently on the kitchen table and slid it toward her. She looked down. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it. She read the first line, then the second, then the bottom. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just sat back in the chair, covered her mouth with one hand, and whispered. He knew from the beginning. And that was it. No apology. No story. No, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." No, "I wanted to protect you." Just those two words. He knew. And somehow, those words hurt more than any lie ever could. Because they meant every look, every cold shoulder, every ignored celebration, every dismissal wasn't by accident. It was deliberate. It was punishment for something I never even knew. I wanted to scream. Why didn't you say anything? Why did you let me think it was my fault? Why did you let him treat me that way? But I didn't. Because in that moment, I saw her, not as a mother, but as a woman, scared, ashamed, trapped in her own web of silence. And I realized something. Her silence wasn't just cowardice. It was grief. Grief for the life she couldn't hold together. Grief for the truth she never had the strength to say. So I didn't press. I didn't push. I just stood up from the table and quietly walked away. Because sometimes what people don't say tells you more than any confession ever could. The next morning, I walked into the hospital. My father was sitting upright in bed, eyes hopeful, expecting an answer, expecting me to say yes. For a moment, I stood at the door, watching the man who had never once shown me warmth, now looking at me, as if I held his life in my hands. And maybe I did. But this time, that power wasn't a burden. It was clarity. I walked to his side, looked him in the eyes, and said calmly, even if I were a match, I wouldn't do it. He blinked. The words stunned him more than if I had shouted. I continued, "I'm not here to be used. I'm not here to fix a family that never made room for me. I spent my whole life trying to be enough for you. And now that I finally am, not because of who I am, but because of what I could give you, you suddenly want me around." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was the loudest "I told you so" I had ever heard. And in that moment, I chose me, not out of vengeance, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from a place you once begged to be accepted in. I left the room without looking back. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't apologizing for who I was. I booked the flight that same afternoon. One way, no return date, no second thoughts. I didn't write a letter. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I packed lightly, not just my suitcase, but my heart too. I left behind the need to be understood, the weight of unspoken expectations, the ache of being tolerated but never loved. As the plane took off, I looked out the window and whispered, "This time, I'm not running away. I'm setting myself free." There were no calls, no texts, no one chasing after me at the airport gate. And for once, I didn't wish they would, because I finally understood. You don't need closure from those who were never open to you. When I landed, the air smelled different. It wasn't the sin of arrival. It was relief. Pure, sacred, unapologetic relief. I turned off my phone, walked into the quiet of my apartment, closed the door, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I exhaled without holding back tears. No guilt, no shame, no more waiting for a permission that was never mine to begin with. Just me and peace. Back in my apartment, everything felt smaller, quieter, gentler. But for once, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a hug. I watered my plants, unpacked slowly, lit a candle I'd been saving for someday, and let the air settle around me like a soft blanket. There was no applause. No one saying, "You were so brave. You did the right thing." But that was okay, because I wasn't looking for applause anymore. I was looking for breath. And here, I could finally breathe. I didn't rush to tell anyone. Didn't post a quote online. Didn't try to make it poetic. I just existed. Freely. Fully. For the first time in years. I wasn't waiting for the next blow, the next request, the next disappointment. There was nothing to fix. No one to please. Just stillness. And it was beautiful. And in that stillness, I realized something. Healing doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a quiet morning, a deep breath, and a moment when your heart finally says, "I'm safe." It was a quiet morning, the kind where the sun comes in soft through the curtains, and the coffee tastes better than usual. Then, my phone lit up, a name I hadn't seen in weeks, one I wasn't sure I ever wanted to see again. "Mom." The message was short. "Please let me talk to you." No emojis, no explanations, just that. And suddenly, all the stillness I had built trembled at the edges. I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered. My breath caught. Because no matter how far you run, some wounds carry their own GPS. They find you. I didn't answer right away. I turned the phone over, as if hiding the light could mute the emotions too. I told myself, you don't owe anyone your peace. You don't have to open that door just because they're knocking. And yet, a part of me was still that child who once waited by the window, hoping someone would come home and choose her. So I did the only thing I could do. When you're not sure whether to move forward or protect yourself, I waited, not to give her time, but to give myself space. Because growth is not always in the answer. Sometimes it's in the pause. She showed up unannounced. No call, no text, just a soft knock on my door. And there she was, my mother, holding a small suitcase in one hand, and her guilt in the other. We stood there for a moment, neither of us knowing what to say. I opened the door, not because I had forgiven her, but because something in her eyes looked like the version of me I used to be. Tired, wounded, still hoping. She sat on the edge of my couch, like she didn't know how to belong in any room anymore. And finally, she said, I was scared of losing everything, of telling you the truth, of what it would make me look like. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rescue her with a soft, "It's okay." I let the words hang. Let them do what they were meant to do. Settle between us like ashes. She kept speaking about the man who left, the one who gave her a child, and then disappeared before he ever held me. She talked about how her parents told her, no one will want a woman with a child. So she clung to the man who would raise me, even if he never loved me. And then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, I thought if I just stayed quiet, it would all work out. I looked at her, this woman who had been a mystery, a wall, a wound, and all I could feel was not rage, not even pity, but a strange, aching kind of understanding. Because sometimes, the people who hurt us are still trying to survive their own pain. That night, she sat at my kitchen table, fidgeting with her teacup like it held the answers. We hadn't said much since her confession, but the air between us felt softer, like grief had melted some of the distance. She looked up at me and asked, barely above a whisper, "Do you still hate me?" I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I needed to feel it fully. And then, I stood, walked toward her, and wrapped my arms around her. She froze. Then she broke. Her shoulders shook. Tears soaked my shirt. And for the first time in my entire life, my mother cried in my arms. I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't. But in that hug, I gave her something she had never earned, but maybe always needed, a chance to stop running. She didn't become a different person that night. She didn't erase the past. But for one fragile moment, We were just two people, holding the parts of each other that still hurt. And that was enough. After she left, the apartment felt quieter than usual. Not lonely, just still. And in that stillness, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a letter, but this time not to her, not to my father, not even to the world. I wrote it to the little girl I once was. Hey you, I saw the way you looked at the door every night, hoping he'd come home and smile at you. I saw you shrink yourself to fit into rooms that never had space for your voice. I saw how you tried so hard to be enough, to be quiet, to be perfect. None of it worked. And that's not your fault. You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were just a child in a house that didn't know how to love you. I'm sorry no one came to your school performances. I'm sorry you had to clap for yourself. I'm sorry they made you feel invisible. But I see you now. I hear you. And I'm here. You don't have to prove anything anymore. You don't have to carry their silence. You're safe now, because I'm grown, and I'm choosing you. I folded the letter and placed it in my journal, not because I needed to remember the pain, but because I never wanted to forget how far we had come. I didn't plan to share it. The letter, the story, the truth. It felt too personal, too raw, too full of shadows I had only just learned to name. But one night, while scrolling through my phone, I came across a forum, a space where strangers whispered truths they couldn't say out loud in real life. And I thought, maybe if I write it anonymously, it won't feel so heavy. So I posted it. No name, no photos, just words. My words. I thought maybe a few people would read it. Maybe someone would scroll by and say, "That's sad," and move on. But that's not what happened. Within hours, comments poured in. I thought I was alone. You just told my story. Thank you for giving words to something I never could explain. I finally feel seen. And just like that, I understood something powerful. Healing isn't just personal. It's communal. When you tell your truth, you give others permission to breathe again, to remember, to release, to begin. I didn't expect to be anyone's voice, but somehow by speaking for myself, I became a mirror for so many others who had never been allowed to look closely. If I could go back, if I could sit across from that little girl I used to be, knees bruised, eyes tired, heart too heavy for her age, I wouldn't try to explain everything. I wouldn't talk about healing or boundaries or forgiveness. I'd just hold her hand and say, slowly and softly, you were never the problem. It wasn't your fault. You didn't have to earn their love. They were supposed to give it freely. I'd look her in the eyes and promise, you don't have to try so hard anymore. You don't have to fix what you didn't break. You get to rest now. You get to laugh. You get to live. And then I'd wrap my arms around her, not to say everything will be perfect, but to let her know, I'm here now. I won't leave you. You're not alone anymore. Because sometimes the healing isn't in what others do. It's in what we finally learn to give ourselves. And if no one else ever shows up, I will. Always. I wasn't chosen. Not by my father. Not by my family. Not even by the ones who claim to love me. But now, I don't need to be. Because today, I choose me. Not out of anger. Not out of rebellion. But out of truth. Out of wholeness. Out of finally understanding what I deserve. I choose the life I've built, quiet, steady, and mine. I choose the friendships that feel like sunrise. The boundaries that protect my peace. The voice I once silenced to make others comfortable. I choose the child I was. I choose the woman I've become. And I choose the future I now believe in. One where I don't have to prove my worth. One where I no longer shrink to fit. One where I get to take up space, fully, fiercely, freely. Because maybe I was never meant to be their version of enough. Maybe I was meant to be me, unapologetically. If this story touched something inside you, if you've ever felt invisible, unworthy, or like you had to fight just to be seen, take a moment. Write a letter to the child you once were. Say the words they needed to hear. Speak the kindness no one gave you. And if someone out there needs to hear this story, share it. Because healing begins with honesty. And maybe this is the first step for someone else, too.